There is a quiet moment that arrives in many lives without warning. Nothing dramatic happens on the surface. The world continues moving at its usual speed. Messages still arrive. Work still demands attention. People still laugh, complain, and make plans for the future. Yet inside, something shifts. A person begins to notice a pattern they can no longer ignore. Not a single failure, but a repetition of small, unfinished beginnings. From the outside, their life may look stable. They have responsibilities. They have opportunities. They may even appear disciplined compared to others. But deep inside lives a silent frustration that grows heavier with time. The feeling of always starting and never becoming. Every Monday carries hope. Goals are written with sincerity. Alarms are set earlier than comfort allows. New routines feel meaningful, almost sacred during the first few days. For a brief moment, the future seems close enough to touch. Then something subtle begins to change. Energy softens, motivation negotiates. Excuses become reasonable. Not dramatic excuses, small, logical ones. The kind that sound intelligent enough to believe. You slept late because you needed rest. You skipped practice because today was unusually stressful. You will restart tomorrow, properly this time. And just like that, the quiet collapse returns. By the end of the week, the promise appears again, familiar and comforting. Next time will be different. But next time rarely is. This story belongs to someone caught inside that invisible loop, someone intelligent enough to understand the problem, yet unable to escape it. His name is not important, because his experience is painfully common. He was capable. He learned quickly. He was respected at work. Nothing about his external life suggested weakness. And still, one private truth followed him everywhere. He could not remain consistent with anything that truly mattered. Exercise lasted days or weeks, never months. Meditation felt meaningful, but disappeared just as quickly. Books were purchased with excitement and abandoned without memory. Each attempt ended the same way, not with a dramatic decision to quit, but with a slow fading of intention. He searched for solutions where most people search: productivity systems, tracking applications, reward structures, public challenges. Each new method created temporary energy. Each one eventually failed. At first, he believed he lacked discipline. Later, he wondered if he simply lacked motivation. Eventually, a more uncomfortable thought appeared. What if the problem is deeper than effort? That question stayed with him longer than the others. One evening, while reading about monastic life, he encountered a detail that seemed almost unreal. In certain spiritual communities, people repeat the same simple practices every single day. Not for weeks, not for months, but for years that quietly become decades. No dramatic variation, no dependence on mood, no waiting for inspiration, just continuation. The idea disturbed him slightly, because the one thing he had never mastered was exactly that, continuing without interruption. He could work intensely for short periods. He could feel powerful bursts of determination, but he could not maintain direction once emotion disappeared. So a new question formed, more precise than the others. How do some people remove the possibility of stopping? At first, he returned to the usual explanation: willpower. But the more he observed disciplined individuals, the less convincing that answer became. They did not look tense. They did not seem locked in daily battles against themselves. Their routines appeared calm, almost ordinary. It was as if their actions required less energy, not more. This confused him, because his own experience of discipline always felt like resistance, a constant pushing against comfort, distraction, and fatigue. Yet these people seemed to move without visible struggle. Slowly, an unfamiliar realization emerged. Maybe consistency is not created by forcing behavior. Maybe it is created by changing identity. This thought felt both simple and dangerous. If behavior comes from identity, then improving habits is not enough. Something more fundamental must change. He began to see the difference everywhere. One person tries to run. Another person lives as a runner. One debates whether to wake early. Another wakes early without discussion. The external action may look identical, but the internal experience is completely different. The first person relies on motivation. The second relies on self-definition. And self-definition does not negotiate. For days, this idea stayed quietly in his mind, returning during ordinary moments, while commuting, while waiting in line, while lying awake at night. A strange possibility appeared. Perhaps he had spent years trying to change his actions without ever deciding who he was. The thought was uncomfortable, because it removed his favorite excuse. If the issue was identity, then no new app, book, or method would solve it alone. Something deeper would be required. Something closer to transformation than improvement. For the first time, he stopped searching for better techniques. Instead, he focused on a single question. What would need to change inside me so that consistency becomes natural rather than forced? This question felt different, quieter, but more serious. It did not promise quick results. It did not offer excitement. It suggested patience, repetition, and uncertainty. And yet, something about it felt true. He sensed that real change might not begin with dramatic action, but with a silent internal decision that no one else could see. Because the greatest barrier was not time, not difficulty, not even failure. The greatest barrier was the invisible belief that he was the kind of person who eventually stops. To move forward, that belief would have to disappear. Not gradually, not partially, completely. He did not yet know how such a change could happen. He did not understand what it would demand from him. He could not imagine how deeply it would reshape his life. But something irreversible had already begun, not in his schedule, not in his routine, inside his perception of himself. And once that perception starts to shift, the old life, even if comfortable, can no longer remain untouched. The real journey had not started with action. It had started with awareness. And awareness, once awakened, rarely allows a person to return to sleep. What he did not understand yet was that awareness alone changes nothing. Seeing the pattern is painful, but remaining the same is still possible. Many people recognize their cycles clearly and continue living inside them for years. Insight, by itself, is weak. Transformation requires something far less comfortable. A decision that removes the option of returning. For several days, he carried this tension quietly. Part of him felt hopeful, as if standing near the entrance of a different life. Another part resisted, whispering familiar arguments. You've tried before. Nothing really changes. Why make this harder than it needs to be? These thoughts did not sound negative. They sounded reasonable. And that is what made them dangerous. Because the most powerful force keeping a person unchanged is not laziness or fear. It is the logic of comfort. Comfort does not shout. It persuades gently. It offers explanations that feel intelligent enough to accept, and for a long time, he had accepted them. But now, something inside him was less willing to agree. Not stronger, not braver, just quieter and more serious. He returned to the idea that had unsettled him days earlier, that some communities live by practices that continue without interruption, independent of mood or circumstance. At first, this sounded extreme, almost inhuman, but the more he reflected on it, the more he realized the opposite might be true. Maybe what looks extreme from the outside is simply clarity from the inside. Because when a decision is truly complete, daily negotiation disappears. And negotiation had always been his real enemy. Every morning of his past attempts followed the same invisible script. The alarm would ring. For a brief second, intention remained pure. Then the conversation began. You slept late yesterday. Today is unusually busy. Missing once won't matter. You can restart tomorrow with more energy. This conversation felt small, almost harmless. Yet it determined everything. Not because the arguments were strong, but because the decision itself had never been final. He began to understand something unsettling. As long as a choice can be reconsidered, it will eventually be abandoned. Real consistency might require something different, not stronger motivation, but irreversibility. The idea frightened him slightly. Irreversible decisions feel dangerous because they remove freedom in the short term, but they may create a deeper freedom later. Freedom from endless internal debate. For the first time, he wondered what would happen if he stopped treating change as an experiment and treated it instead as a commitment that could not be quietly undone. This thought stayed with him late into the night. He realized that most of his previous goals were private, hidden, easy to abandon without consequence. If he failed, no one truly knew. And if no one knew, his identity remained untouched. Failure stayed temporary. Comfort remained available. But what if the opposite were true? What if change required visibility? Not for attention, not for approval, but to make retreat emotionally expensive. The idea felt uncomfortable enough to matter. The next morning, before he had time to reconsider, he wrote a single clear statement on paper. Not a wish, not a vague intention, a declaration of who he would be for the next 90 days. The words were simple, almost ordinary. Yet while writing them, he felt a quiet tension in his chest, the sensation that something real was happening. Because clarity removes hiding places. He looked at the sentence for a long time. Part of him wanted to soften it, to add flexibility, to include an escape clause disguised as kindness. He did not. Instead, he left it exact, uncomfortable, definite. Then he did something he had avoided his entire life. He allowed other people to see it, not dramatically, not with explanation, just enough that retreat would no longer be invisible. The moment passed quickly. No thunder, no sudden transformation. But inside, something subtle shifted. The decision no longer belonged only to his thoughts. It now existed in the world, and once a decision becomes visible, it begins to shape identity in a different way. The following morning arrived quietly. No surge of motivation, no inspiring emotion, only the ordinary sound of an alarm in the dark. For a brief second, the old negotiation tried to appear. The familiar opening lines formed automatically. Then something unusual happened. The conversation stopped before it fully began. Not because he felt strong, but because the decision had already been made somewhere deeper than emotion. He moved without drama. Slowly, imperfectly, still tired. But he moved. The action itself was small, almost insignificant compared to the grand plans he once imagined. Yet when it was finished, he felt a different kind of emotion. Not excitement, not pride, but quiet stability. The day continued normally. Work remained demanding. Distractions still existed. Nothing magical protected him from difficulty. And yet, beneath the surface, a fragile thread of continuity had appeared. That night, he noticed something new, not confidence. It was too early for that, but a faint sense of trust. Not in the future, not in motivation, in process. The second morning was harder, the third even harder, because the mind, sensing real change, often increases resistance before surrendering. Old thoughts returned with sharper arguments. Old comforts felt more attractive than usual. This was not failure. It was friction, the natural response of a life being redirected. He did not win perfectly. He did not feel heroic. He simply repeated the same small action again and again. Days passed without drama. No visible transformation. No external reward. Only repetition. But repetition, when protected from interruption, begins to do quiet work beneath awareness. Work that cannot be rushed. Work that cannot be faked. Work that slowly reshapes the boundary between who a person was and who they are becoming. He could not see that boundary clearly yet, but he could feel it forming, thin as a line of light before sunrise. And somewhere inside that growing light lived a realization still too early to name. That consistency is not built in moments of strength, but in moments when strength is absent and the action continues anyway. By the time the first few weeks had passed, nothing extraordinary could be seen from the outside. He did not look transformed. His life had not suddenly become easier. No one would have pointed at him and said, "Something important is happening there." And yet, beneath the surface, a quiet restructuring was underway. The small action he repeated each morning was still simple, still imperfect, still far from impressive, but it was no longer fragile. In the past, his efforts always depended on emotion. A good mood created momentum. A difficult day destroyed it. Now something different was forming. A rhythm that did not ask how he felt before continuing. This change was subtle enough to miss unless you were the one living inside it. There were still hard mornings, still moments of resistance, still thoughts suggesting rest, delay, or compromise. But those thoughts were beginning to lose authority. They still spoke. He simply no longer obeyed automatically. That was new. For most of his life, discomfort had been a signal to stop. Now discomfort was becoming neutral, not pleasant, not unbearable, just present. And when discomfort stops controlling direction, freedom quietly begins. Around the middle of the second month, he noticed something that unsettled him more than failure ever had. Some mornings, he completed the entire routine, and only afterward realized he had done it. There had been no internal speech, no debate, no motivation, just movement. At first, this felt mechanical, almost unnatural. He wondered if losing the struggle meant losing meaning. But over time, he understood something deeper. The absence of struggle is not emptiness. It is efficiency. Energy once wasted on deciding was now available for living. This was the first real sign that change was no longer theoretical. His environment, however, did not transform with him. People around him remained the same. Schedules were still demanding. Unexpected problems still appeared without warning. One week brought illness. Another brought travel. Another brought emotional exhaustion that would have ended any previous attempt. In earlier years, each of these would have created a pause. And every pause eventually became an ending. Now he faced a different question. What does continuation look like when conditions are no longer ideal? The answer surprised him. Continuation did not require perfection. It required refusal to disappear. On the day he felt physically weakest, the action became smaller, but it did not vanish. During travel, the routine became quieter, but it did not vanish. On the most chaotic schedule, the practice became shorter, but it did not vanish. For the first time in his life, difficulty changed the form of his effort without stopping its existence. That distinction changed everything, because stopping had never been caused by difficulty alone. It had been caused by the belief that imperfect effort was meaningless. Now he was learning the opposite truth. Imperfect continuation is infinitely stronger than perfect interruption. This realization did not feel dramatic. It felt steady, grounded, real. And reality, unlike motivation, does not fade overnight. Somewhere near the end of the third month, another shift occurred. So quiet, he almost missed it. He stopped thinking about the 90-day mark. In the beginning, the number had felt important. A finish line, proof of change, evidence that this time was different. But now the number mattered less, because the routine was no longer a challenge to complete. It was simply part of the day, like waking, eating, or breathing. He had not forced himself into discipline. He had slowly removed the version of himself that always stopped. This was not the dramatic rebirth he once imagined transformation would require. No sudden enlightenment, no moment of overwhelming certainty, just the gradual disappearance of an old limitation. And in its place, something quieter, but far more stable. Trust in his own continuity. When the 90th day finally arrived, there was no celebration, no powerful emotion, no sense of victory, only a calm understanding. The number had never been the goal. The real change was this. He no longer needed a countdown to keep going tomorrow. For years, he had believed strong people were those who never struggled. Now he saw something different. Strength was not intensity, not perfection, not constant motivation. Strength was persistence without drama. The ability to continue when no one was watching, when nothing felt inspiring, when progress was too slow to notice. A few people around him began to sense the difference. They could not always explain it, but they felt it. Some called it discipline. Others called it obsession. A few suggested he should relax more, as if steadiness were a kind of imbalance. He listened without argument, because he understood something they could not. See, from the outside, consistency looks extreme only in a world where quitting is normal. He did not feel extreme. He felt peaceful. Not because life had become easy, but because one internal conflict had ended. The daily question of will I continue no longer existed, and the silence left behind by that question created space for something unexpected. Attention, clarity, presence, energy, once spent on restarting life, could now be used to actually live it. Looking back, The transformation seemed almost invisible. No single day had changed everything. No moment could be identified as the turning point. And yet, everything was different. He had begun as someone searching for the perfect method. He became someone who simply continues. That difference is quiet, but it is absolute. Because when continuation becomes identity, discipline is no longer something you practice. It is something you are. And once a person reaches that place, the question is no longer, how do I stay consistent? The question becomes unnecessary, like asking how to keep breathing. You don't. You just do.